Jack the Ripper didn't want to just kill women. He wanted to obliterate them.
You've got an offender who's prolific, who's predatory, who's killing women.
The case of Jack the Ripper is closer to being solved than ever before. You heard that right. After 137 years, we have a name strongly linked by science. It's not a guess, not a theory, but a name pulled from physical DNA evidence left at the scene in 1888. We're going to talk about the man, Aaron Kosminski, but the who is only part of the story. The how is even more incredible. It involves a historic artifact, a persistent geneticist, and a breakthrough that almost didn't happen. This discovery doesn't just point to a suspect, it changes history. The world of 1888. What many people overlook is the sheer scale of this. By 1888, the East End had swelled to nearly 1 million people, crammed into areas known as rookeries. These were slums so dangerous and diseased that police often refused to go in, even in daylight. Sanitation was almost non-existent. The streets were filled with mud, refuse, and horse manure, sometimes inches deep. Outbreaks of diseases like cholera and smallpox were common, and blanketing it all, especially in autumn, was the pea super, a thick yellow choking fog, a mix of river mist and coal smoke that could reduce visibility to just a few feet. It was the perfect cover for a crime. This district had become a hotspot for crime, disease, and desperation, a breeding ground for the vulnerabilities that would soon be exploited by one of history's most infamous figures, Jack the Ripper. The area's grim environment reflected the stark inequalities of Victorian England, where rapid industrialization had spurred economic growth for some but deepened the plight of the working poor. Whitechapel's population was swollen by recent arrivals, including a significant number of Eastern European Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution, who lived crammed into dilapidated tenements with limited sanitation and scarce employment opportunities. There were over 4,000 people packed into a single square mile. This backdrop of hardship and social neglect created an atmosphere rife with fear and suspicion, setting the stage for a chilling series of events that would horrify not only London but the entire world. The acts attributed to Jack the Ripper occurred over a relatively brief but intensely dramatic period, spanning from August to November of 1888. The attacker's reign of terror began with the brutal end of Mary Ann Nichols on August 31, 1888, followed closely by Annie Chapman on September 8th. These initial victims were both local women struggling with poverty and addiction, living on the margins of society. What shocked the public and law enforcement alike was the savage nature of the attacks. The victims were not only ended, but they were also brutalized in ways that suggested the perpetrator possessed some kind of anatomical knowledge. The third and arguably most notorious victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found on September 30th, followed mere hours later by Catherine Eddowes. This double event sent a wave of true panic through the city. Eddowes' ending was marked by particularly gruesome mutilations. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was discovered on November 9, 1888, in her own lodgings. The horror here was on another level. Her injuries were so horrific that they seemed to epitomize the attacker's brutal signature. These 5 events, often referred to as the Canonical 5, are the ones most widely accepted by historians and criminologists as the work of the same individual, although speculation has linked other unsolved acts in the area to the Ripper's shadow. The social impact of these events on Victorian society was profound and far-reaching. Whitechapel's already precarious reputation as a dangerous and undesirable quarter was amplified by the violence and mystery, feeding into the broader anxieties of a society grappling with rapid urbanization and class divisions. The acts exposed the stark inequalities faced by the urban poor and ignited public debate about the failures of social policy, policing, and healthcare for marginalized communities. 5 lives ended. The chilling saga of Jack the Ripper is inextricably tied to the tragic lives and brutal ends of 5 women, known collectively as the Canonical 5 victims. Each of these women was a resident of London's East End, struggling against poverty and hardship in the overcrowded, grim streets of Whitechapel. They were not just statistics. They were mothers, daughters, and wives who had fallen on hard times. Mary Ann Nichols, the first of the canonical 5 victims, was found on the morning of August 31, 1888, in Bucks Row, now Durward Street. She was a 43-year-old woman who had endured a life of hardship, having lost her husband and struggling with alcoholism. Nichols had been living in and out of workhouses. The thing nobody tells you is that just hours before she was found, she was turned away from a lodging house because she didn't have the 4 pence for a bed. Her last known words to the lodging house keeper were, "I'll soon be back. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She was found lifeless with signs that would soon become a horrific hallmark of the attacker. Her end shocked the community, marking the beginning of a dark chapter in London's history. Just over a week later, on September 8, 1888, Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Chapman was 47 years old and, like Nichols, faced a life scarred by poverty, addiction, and family breakdown. She had recently lost her husband and was living in a common lodging house, trying to support herself through occasional work and by walking the streets, a common means of survival for many women in Whitechapel. What's wild is what they found on her: a comb, a piece of an envelope, and a few other small items. Her ending was notably more gruesome. The savage nature of Chapman's end suggested the attacker had anatomical knowledge, fueling public speculation and fear. The ends of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the night of September 30th, 1888, intensified the terror gripping London. This was the double event. Elizabeth Stride, often known by her alias Long Liz, was 44 years old and a Swedish-born woman who lived in Whitechapel. Unlike the other victims, Stride's case was less mutilative. This anomaly led investigators to speculate that the attacker might have been interrupted or forced to flee prematurely. A witness later said he saw a man with a woman matching her description just moments before she was found. Stride was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street, and her case raised questions about whether all the Whitechapel events were connected. Catherine Eddowes, found just 45 minutes after Stride on the same night, was 46 years old. Her life, like those of the other victims, was marked by poverty and hardship. In a strange twist of fate, Eddowes had actually been in police custody earlier that evening for being drunk and disorderly. She was released at 1 a.m., giving a false name to the police. Less than an hour later, she was found in Mitre Square in the City of London, distinguished by more brutal mutilations than any prior victim. The fact that these two events occurred so close in time and location suggested a terrifying spree, amplifying public panic and overwhelming the police forces. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was discovered on November 9, 1888, in her room at 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street. Kelly was the youngest of the victims at just 25 years old and was believed to be a local escort who had lived a turbulent life. Her end was the most gruesome and personal. The mutilations were far more extensive and savage than previous ones. Unlike the others, Kelly was attacked indoors in her own small single-room apartment. This gave the attacker far more time to inflict his terrible signature. The scene was so horrifying that experienced police officers were visibly shaken, and the landlord who found her was in shock for days. What linked these 5 events unmistakably were the signature mutilations that bore the hallmark of the same perpetrator. The attacker appeared to be not only brutal but methodical, possibly possessing anatomical or surgical knowledge. These grisly mutilations led the press and investigators to label the unknown assailant Jack the Ripper, a name that has since become synonymous with terror and mystery. The pattern was horrifying, but the way he did it baffled everyone. The anatomical knowledge debate. The attacker's ability to move unnoticed through the darkened streets of Whitechapel suggested a man who either lived locally or spent enough time in the area to study its geography and rhythms. The choice of targets, women struggling on the streets, was not arbitrary. You see, these women were among the most socially and economically marginalized individuals in Victorian London. They worked at night, often alone in poorly lit areas, and due to the nature of their work, they were accustomed to entering secluded spaces with strangers. The Ripper exploited these circumstances, identifying women who were isolated, likely desperate for money, and unlikely to raise alarm once lured into a dark alley or courtyard. The attacker's approach appears to have involved a careful selection process, observing his potential victims from a distance or engaging them in brief conversation. He seemed to possess the patience and control to watch without acting until the perfect opportunity arose. It's likely that he blended in with the local population, making him inconspicuous. He may have possibly even looked respectable or unthreatening enough to disarm suspicion. This careful timing is evident from the fact that many of the attacks occurred just minutes before the bodies were discovered, suggesting that the attacker worked quickly and precisely. What's also evident is that Jack the Ripper used the layout of Whitechapel to his advantage. The district was a warren of alleys, courts, backyards, and lodging houses, ideal for disappearing quickly. This urban topography allowed the attacker to vanish into the shadows within moments. He operated in a compact zone, less than a square mile, where he felt comfortable and in control. But the thing that truly set this case apart and terrified the public was the communication. The police and newspapers received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the attacker. Most were hoaxes from cruel opportunists. But a few stood out. The most famous was the Dear Boss letter, received on September 27th. It was written in red ink, mocked the police, and was signed with the name that would become legend, Jack the Ripper. At first, police thought it was just another fake, but 3 days later, Catherine Eddowes was found, and part of her ear had been clipped. The letter had chillingly promised to clip the lady's ears off. Then came the From Hell letter. This one was delivered to the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of citizens trying to catch the attacker. It arrived in a small box. Inside was half of a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The letter claimed it was from the attacker, who said he had fried and ate the other half. Some doctors at the time said the kidney matched the one taken from Catherine Eddowes. And then there was the Golston Street graffito. After the double event, police found a piece of Eddowes' blood-stained apron in a doorway on Golston Street. Above it, written in chalk on the wall, was a message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The police commissioner at the time famously ordered the writing to be erased immediately, fearing it would spark anti-Semitic riots in the area. This decision was massively controversial. Was it a genuine clue from the Ripper, or just hateful graffiti? We will never know. The debate over his modus operandi always comes back to the anatomical knowledge. The mutilations were precise. Some organs were removed with what seemed like skill. This led to the popular theory that the Ripper must have been a doctor, a surgeon, or at least a butcher. This gentleman killer theory, an educated man descending into the slums to perform his dark work, captured the public's imagination. But not all experts agreed. Some argued the wounds were savage and rough, not skillful. They suggested anyone with a sharp knife and a basic understanding of anatomy, like a butcher, or as we'll see, maybe even a hairdresser, could have done it. The police were lost, grasping at shadows and strange clues. Why he was never caught. From the outset, the investigation was complicated by jurisdictional issues. You see, London's policing was split. The murders spanned areas policed by both the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police. Mary Ann Nichols was found in Met territory, but Catherine Eddowes was found in the square mile of the city, a separate jurisdiction. This division required coordination between the two police forces, which was not always seamless. To put it mildly, they were stepping on each other's toes. Despite these challenges, a seasoned lead detective took a leading role. But the limitations of forensic science during the late 19th century were among the greatest obstacles. The modern tools of crime scene investigation, such as fingerprinting, DNA analysis, and sophisticated forensic pathology, were non-existent. Fingerprinting was decades away from being used as evidence. DNA wouldn't be discovered for almost a century. Crime scenes were hopelessly contaminated. The moment a body was found, crowds of onlookers, reporters, and even police officers themselves would swarm the area, trampling over any potential evidence. Witness testimonies became a cornerstone of the investigation, though their reliability was questionable. Many residents of Whitechapel were mistrustful of the police. Descriptions of suspicious men varied wildly. Some said he was tall, some short, some well-dressed, some shabby. Public panic, fanned by the newspapers, made things worse. The police were flooded with tips. They investigated over 2,000 people. They detained over 80. They even tried using bloodhounds, but the trail went cold in the crowded, contaminated streets. Throughout the inquiry, an overwhelming number of suspects were proposed. The list is long and in some cases bizarre. It ranged from local butchers and surgeons to prominent figures, famous artists, and even members of the British royal family. The royal theory that the attacks were a conspiracy to cover up a prince's secret affairs has been a popular one in books and movies, but it has been thoroughly debunked by historians. But among the sea of names, the police had a few serious suspects. One was a barrister and schoolteacher who mysteriously vanished and was found having ended his own life in the Thames River in early December 1888, right after the final Canonical event. Some detectives believe this was the man simply because the attack stopped when he perished. Another suspect was a Russian-born conman and thief who was known to be violent and was detained in asylums. But records show he was likely in a French prison during the attacks. And then there was Aaron Kosminski. This is the name that matters. Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant who had fled persecution and worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. He was on the police's radar at the time. He lived right in the middle of the area where the attacks happened. He was known to be mentally unwell, suffering from what we would now likely call paranoid schizophrenia. He was described as having a strong hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies. In fact, one of the officers who oversaw the investigation later wrote in his notes that he believed Kos-MIN-ski was the Ripper. A famous internal police memorandum from 1894 also named Kosminski as a primary suspect, noting that he became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. Kosminski was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891, where he remained until his passing in 1919. Just like with the other suspect, the attack stopped right around the time he was institutionalized. The police suspected him. They may have even had him under surveillance, but they never had enough evidence to charge him. The case went cold. For over a century, it all remained theory. Until now. Science solves the unsolvable. The story of Jack the Ripper took a fascinating new turn in the 21st century. It all started with an amateur historian who became obsessed with the case. In 2007, he bought a Victorian-era shawl at an auction. This wasn't just any shawl. The story went that it was found at the crime scene of the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. The shawl was allegedly taken from the scene by a police officer who wanted to give it to his wife. She, horrified by the bloodstains, refused to wear it, and it was packed away, passed down through his family for over 100 years. This shawl was stained with what appeared to be blood and other bodily fluids. For years, ripperologists had debated its authenticity. But this researcher saw an opportunity. What if modern science could pull a secret from those old threads? He teamed up with a molecular biologist specializing in forensic genetics. Their goal, to find DNA on a 130-plus-year-old piece of fabric. This was a long shot, to put it mildly. The DNA would be incredibly degraded and, worse, contaminated. Think about it. That shawl had been handled by countless people over more than a century, but the specialist used cutting-edge techniques. He carefully extracted samples from the darkest stains. They focused on a specific type of genetic material, mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA. Here's the wow factor on mtDNA. Explained simply, most of your DNA, the nuclear DNA, is a mix from both your parents. But mtDNA is different. It's passed down directly from a mother to her children, unchanged through the generations. It's like a perfect family signature on the maternal side. It's also tougher than nuclear DNA and exists in much larger quantities in each cell, making it the perfect target for old, degraded samples. They successfully extracted 2 distinct mtDNA profiles from the shawl. First, to prove the shawl was actually at the crime scene, they had to link it to the victim, Catherine Eddowes. They tracked down a living descendant of Eddowes' sister. They took a DNA sample from her. And the result? A perfect match. The first profile on the shawl belonged to Catherine Eddowes' family line. This was huge. It meant the shawl was almost certainly authentic. But what about the other stains? The ones that might belong to the attacker? From these stains, the biologist extracted a second, separate mtDNA profile. Now they needed a suspect to match it to. Remember Aaron Kosminski, the Polish hairdresser who was the police's prime suspect? The research team went looking for his living relatives. They found a living female descendant of Kosminski's sister. They took a DNA sample. And when they compared it to the second profile from the shawl, it was a perfect match. The results were eventually published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. For the first time in history, a physical forensic link had been made between a specific suspect and the Jack the Ripper crime scenes. The science pointed directly to Kos-MIN-ski. The man the police suspected all along, the man living in the heart of Whitechapel, was, according to this science, the one who left his genetic fingerprint on Catherine Eddowes' shawl. But not everyone is convinced. The scientific community and true crime experts have approached the conclusions with serious skepticism. Critics point out that the published paper didn't release the full, raw DNA sequences, making it hard for other scientists to verify the work. The biggest problem, they say, is contamination. That shawl was handled by everyone. How do we know this DNA isn't from one of the victim's descendants who handled it, or even from one of the scientists? Furthermore, mitochondrial DNA isn't like a unique fingerprint. It just links to a maternal family line. It's possible, though perhaps unlikely, that thousands of other people in London at the time shared that same mtDNA profile. The paper's authors say the specific profile is rare, but the criticism remains. The evidence is tantalizing, but it's not the same as a nuclear DNA match that can be pinpointed to one single person. But is this new science truly the end of the story? Beyond the Ripper. The debate around the Ripper DNA highlights just how far forensic science has come. The genesis of DNA in criminal justice is often traced back to 1986 with a landmark case in the United Kingdom. This marked the first time DNA evidence was used to convict an attacker. A man was found guilty of the assault and ending of two teenage girls after DNA samples collected at the crime scenes were matched to him. This breakthrough ushered in a new era. Since then, forensic technology has advanced at a remarkable pace. Early DNA tests required relatively large, fresh biological samples. But modern techniques like polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, can photocopy DNA, amplifying a tiny, degraded sample into millions of usable copies. This is what allows scientists to examine microscopic traces of DNA found in hair follicles, bone fragments, bloodstains, or even the touch DNA left behind in a fingerprint on a glass. The role of DNA testing in solving cold cases extends well beyond high-profile historical mysteries. Across the globe, law enforcement agencies have harnessed forensic genetics to reopen and resolve thousands of cold cases. This has led to numerous exonerations, freeing people wrongfully convicted as well as the apprehension of offenders who might have escaped justice for decades. Forensic DNA testing has also been instrumental in developing large databases, like the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS in the United States, established in the 1990s. These systems facilitate the comparison of DNA profiles across jurisdictions, matching crime scene DNA to profiles of convicted offenders. The creation and expansion of such databases have been a key factor in the successful resolution of many cold cases. But the real game changer, and the one most relevant to the Ripper case, is genealogical DNA testing. This is where it gets wild. By comparing crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases, like the ones people use to trace their ancestry, investigators can identify suspects through familial matches. This technique famously helped identify the Golden State Killer in California in 2018, decades after his crimes. They found a partial match to a distant cousin, then built a family tree that led them right to the suspect. This exact same logic was used in 2022 to finally identify the boy in the box, a young boy found in Philadelphia in 1957. However, the use of DNA in cold case investigations is not without challenges. The quality and preservation of evidence from older cases can vary widely, and contamination remains a massive concern. This is the central argument against the Ripper findings. Additionally, the ethical and privacy implications of expanding DNA databases and genealogical searches are topics of ongoing debate. When you upload your DNA to a family tree website, are you also giving police permission to investigate your entire family? Despite these issues, the benefits are undeniable. For the descendants of the Ripper's victims, the research has offered an extraordinary sense of emotional closure. More than a century after their ancestors' brutal ends, families could finally see a glimmer of resolution. The confirmation of Kosminski's DNA on the shawl, if accepted, means history can definitively name the man behind the grisly acts that terrorized Victorian London. Science can find a name, but can it change history? A ghost put to rest? So is this it? Is the mystery of Jack the Ripper, the greatest whodunit in history, finally solved? As with anything this big, the answer is complicated. Many people watching this are probably wondering if it's really true, if it all just happened overnight, or if we're missing a key detail. The thing is, we have to look at both sides. On one hand, this is the only piece of physical evidence from an 1888 Ripper crime scene that has ever been forensically linked to a named suspect. The researchers matched DNA from the victim's shawl to a descendant of Catherine Eddowes. Then they matched other DNA from the same shawl to a descendant of the prime suspect, Kos-MIN-ski, the man who the highest-ranking police officers at the time believed was the one. That is, to put it mildly, a bombshell. It feels like the final puzzle piece clicking into place. But on the other hand, the critics have very valid points. The shawl has a long, undocumented history. It was handled by who knows how many people. Contamination is a huge risk. And the science itself, mitochondrial DNA, isn't a unique identifier. It just points to a family line. While Kosminski's maternal line might be rare, it doesn't prove with 100% certainty that he was the one who left that sample. So, does this change British history as the title claims? The answer is a resounding yes. For over a century, the Jack the Ripper legend has been dominated by Ripperology, a world of amateur detectives, conspiracy theories, and let's be honest, a lot of nonsense. The most popular theories always lean toward the sensational. He was a brilliant surgeon, an artist, or even a member of the royal family. These theories turned the Ripper into a dark, romantic, almost supervillain figure. What this DNA evidence does, whether you fully believe it or not, is ground the story in a much darker, sadder, and more believable reality. It erases the myth of the gentleman killer in a top hat and cloak. Instead, it points to exactly the kind of person the police thought it was. A local, mentally unwell, and deeply troubled man. Kos-MIN-ski wasn't a criminal genius. He was a tragic and disturbed individual living in the squalor of Whitechapel who was eventually consumed by his own illness. This discovery changes history by ending the myth and replacing it with a grim human story. It takes the focus off the sensationalized bogeyman and puts it back on the real victims, the failed police investigation, and the social horrors of Whitechapel. The legend of Jack is a fantasy. The reality of a man like Kos-MIN-ski is a tragedy. And now, thanks to a few cells of DNA on an old shawl, that's the story history will likely tell. So what do you think? Is the DNA from the shawl proof enough to finally close the case on Kos-MIN-ski? Or is it just another interesting theory and a mystery that will never truly be solved? Let us know your verdict in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more mysteries solved.